The top foreign policy priority for the next president will be to get our own house in order, to reestablish the credibility of the United States as a country committed to the rule of law. This will not be an easy task, and especially it won't be easy because of where we stand in the opinion of the world today as a result of what's happened. There's a huge foreign policy paradox. We have never had more military, economic power in the world than we have today, despite all of the economic challenges we face. But we have never, certainly not in our lifetimes, and I would argue probably in the entire lifetime of our country, stood lower in the opinion of the world than we do today. And if you look just 10 years ago at polling data, it was quite different. The global view of the U.S. was relatively favorable. Obviously, there were bumpy spots, to be sure, but the Pew polls, the BBC polls, a number of polls that I've studied very closely, showed Germany supporting the U.S., roughly 78% of the population, Indonesia, 75%, France, 62%, Turkey, 52%. You could go around the world and you'd find, generally speaking, that while disagreements with U.S. policy would be frequent, the opinion was very high. The BBC poll that was conducted earlier this year was devastating. In 18 countries, only 29% of the publics have a positive view of the U.S. 67% of the people in those countries see the U.S. as a violator of international human rights, citing especially Guantanamo, Abu Ghraib, the secret renditions of people for purposes of torture and interrogation itself. 70% of those polled in these 18 countries see the U.S. military presence in Iraq as provoking conflict and violating international legal principles. And finally, another poll conducted by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs shows that majorities in 13 countries on all continents say that, and I quote, "the U.S. cannot be trusted to act responsibly in the world." So we have a very deep hole to dig out of just to conduct our foreign policy and to defend our national security. What we've seen is a drastic loss of the very essence of what a country like the United States needs to exercise its foreign policy objectives, wherever you may stand in the political perspective on those objectives, and that is a basic principle of soft power, which is the power to attract rather than to coerce. And we've been relatively good in the past at exercising soft power. Again, there have been plenty of times when we've failed, but we've consistently failed over these last 8 years. There are really three fundamental rules for the exercise of soft power in international affairs, and they've all been shattered. First, they're very basic. I mean, they're the kind of rules that Jonathan would instruct his sons, I'm sure. Practice what you preach, or certainly we as parents should do that. But the world has seen the U.S. Acting very hypocritically on such issues as human rights and the rule of law when it comes to the ways in which torture, secret detentions, the denial of habeas corpus. We're not here to give you a litany of the various abuses. You know many of them. Second principle, if you're going to exercise soft power, is to obey the law. And what we've had is, of course, a flagrant disregard of international as well as domestic law in the name of the unitary executive that we've begun to explore here today in pressing forward on the war on terror. What we have effectively in places like Guantanamo is an area that's been declared law-free. Law-free when it comes to the Constitution and law-free when it comes to international law, such as the Geneva Conventions and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the Torture Convention, all of which have been ratified and are part of our own domestic law. The third principle that you need to follow is basically to support international institutions. And here, the whole U.S. unilateralism and the disregard for the treaties that I've just cited and the UN Charter, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, has put forward a strong view to the world that the U.S. is not supportive of the kinds of international institutions that we have built and helped to build in a bipartisan way over the last 50 years. The result is a significant undermining of our national security in 4 areas. First, countering terrorism. Again, whatever one may think about the range of threats that are presented by terrorism, nonetheless, the ability to counter whatever the terrorism presents is severely undermined by this negative international view, and certainly terrorist recruitment, as many studies have shown, has been helped in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and in Pakistan. Second, we have found the ability to build strategic alliances to be significantly undermined by this trend. The strains on the NATO alliance that we've seen, the European relations that have been strained, the difficulty in getting troop commitments to come to Afghanistan, something that's being pressed today, and that's a result, I think, of the very great difficulty that we've created in our relations with our allies. Third is dealing with some of the geopolitical rivals that we have, or countries that we need to work with, but who are not necessarily allies. China, Russia in particular. China has now gone on the offensive very effectively in the human rights area and has started putting out reports annually on human rights in the United States. The U.S. has previously put out reports and continues to do so on the conditions of human rights in China. But there's enough for China to project in terms of trying to soften the impact, and successfully doing so in its efforts to reject U.S. criticisms on human rights as a result of what the U.S. has done itself. In Russia, there's been plenty of evidence that the war on terror has essentially reinforced the efforts of the authoritarian approaches taken by some elements of the Russian government to repress democracy in the name of fighting terrorism. And finally, the fourth area is dealing with failed states and the kinds of crises that we've seen in the past, Bosnia, Rwanda, horrors of that nature, and stopping crimes against humanity. But what we have now is an inability to mobilize alliances and to address human rights catastrophes like the one in Darfur. First, I think we need to make clear that the U.S. is bound by the international rule of law. We need to close the Guantanamo detention facility. Fortunately, both leading candidates have called for its closing. We need to restore habeas corpus. We need to try terror suspects. We need to stop this whole process of what the world sees as endless detention. Second, we need to restate the U.S. commitment to international law and treaties in the areas that we've ratified and that are part of our own domestic law, the treaties that I mentioned before, the Geneva Conventions and International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Third, we need to establish a United States Commission on Human Rights. And I'm pleased to say that last month a bill was introduced in the House of Representatives to do this. So I want to spend just a few moments before I conclude by telling you about this bill, because I think it's an important way for Congress to begin to reassert itself in this field where we've seen so much power basically has passed to the executive because the Congress has failed to do anything. What this commission would do would be to create a bipartisan, bicameral means of monitoring the enforcement of international law that we have adopted as our own law. It would require reports regularly by the Attorney General and by the Secretary of State. It would have subpoena power to allow the investigation of violations in this area. And it would, above all, be the process by which Congress, in a bipartisan way, would begin to take back the power that it's ceded. So, in essence, I've outlined for you what is a fairly conservative agenda. I mean, I think this is an agenda that should appeal across party lines, particularly in this last piece of legislation that I mentioned, because our own national security is at risk as a result of what has been done. And I think the only way to restore it is to restore the rule of law in the international sphere as well as in the domestic sphere.